Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. So thank you for joining us again. Today we are very privileged to have two of the finest scholars in Canada and also in our field to join us as our speakers and to share their most recent work on TESOL as critical sociolinguistic practice and embodied practice, critical sociolinguistic inquiry and embodied practice. We noticed that in recent years, there has been more and more work to revisit the basic tenets of TESOL, and also to reconceptualize TESOL in a more inclusive, in a more equitable way. So we are again very privileged. Dr. Sunny now from Bishop's University in Quebec, Sunny, and Dr. Saskia Van Liegen from York University, Toronto, Saskia. And also we are also very lucky to have an international professor, a professor from Singapore, Dr. Mukhlis Abu Bakr from National Institute of Education in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and he's visiting SFU right now. Mukhlis, Dr. Bakr is a Malay language education specialist. And also we have our host, Dr. Bongyi Song, our postdoc research fellow at SFU. Thanks, Bongyi, for preparing all the questions. And our doctoral students from SFU, Tsinghua. Okay, so we will start the seminar with about a brief presentation, like 20 minutes presentation of the main ideas from your recent work. So over to you, Dr. Sunny Lau and Dr. Saskia Van Liegen.
Thank you, Angel, for inviting us, and thank you for this great opportunity to share with you all our recent work. And Saskia, would you like to go ahead and give a brief summary of our main proposition, and then we will open for discussion.
Sure. I just wanted to start off, like Sunny, thanking you, Angel, for having us in conversation and in dialogue. I think this opportunity to come back to this channel, we came a few years ago, I guess 2 years ago, when the channel was just starting to talk about our ideas around thinking about language teaching as critical sociolinguistic. Well, actually, I think we called it at that time becoming critical sociolinguists with our students. And since that time, we and I have been engaged in ongoing writing and dialogue about what does it mean to teach language in the contemporary time, and what does it mean to think beyond just monolingual orientation to language teaching that upholds particular linguistic hierarchy, tends to uphold particular linguistic hierarchies, and it is also very much rooted in applied linguistics from that has privileged particular language standards around English, that has privileged whiteness in the field, and that has tended to look at language teaching and learning as a neutral, and to look at our theories as neutral. We've been thinking about this and engaging with the work of other scholars to see this practice and enterprise as something different. And this is where we have come up with an understanding of doing critical sociolinguistic inquiry with students and also engaging in embodied practice. And so this encompasses not just a different way of teaching, but a different way of knowing and thinking about language, and knowing and thinking about our roles and our students differently. So it's an ontological shift but also an enacted shift. So an ontology and also an epistemology that is different. I'll just pause there and maybe turn it back over to you, Sunny, and then maybe we can go over the different aspects of the lenses that we're thinking of and the different words comprised in that title.
Thank you, Saskia, for a really good summary of our paper. I think that we both think that we are at a juncture, a lot of possibilities and openings, especially with the changing understanding of language in the field of applied linguistics. For example, we have a lot of approaches talking about plurilingualism or translanguaging. This helps us to step back and look at what it means to to use a language, what it means to understand something, what it means to live or to live some language practices. And I think the recent articulation of translanguaging and all these plurilingual pedagogies allow us to see boundary breaking, border crossing practices, which is not just common, but has to be reclaimed and recognized and used to the fullest extent for us to understand language. So then what are the implications for teaching and learning then? In other fields, there have been movements towards human decentering approaches like post-humanism and social materialism, looking at language as processes, but not just language, but how linguistic and non-linguistic forms, human and non-human resources, they all interact and intersect in order to create new meanings and new understanding and new being, right? But in our field, we never look at those things. And so we try to incorporate all these understandings and to help us to systematically look at the implications for our field. How do we teach them? And how do we live that process as teachers and students?
And I think another piece that has been important to us is when we have been thinking first about the multilingual turn and about the shift towards translanguaging as a theoretical lens or a descriptive lens to engage with the practices of bilingualism and multilingualism that are all around us, that are part of our sociolinguistic ecologies. We very much want to stay connected to the critical dimension of this work, because just because we are seeing multilingualism, just because we are creating spaces in our pedagogic or assessment practice to engage with multilingualism or to view things from a translanguaging or plurilingual perspective, doesn't necessarily always mean that we are being critical. And aligning this with, aligning these understandings of language with the material inequities and the ecological crises and issues of our times. These aspects of our field have never been, I don't want to say have never been, they are always, these aspects of our lives have always been part of practice. But how can we make these visible, and how can we ensure that we are engaging in relation not only to one another as humans, but also to the ecological aspects of our experience and the environmental catastrophes, the health issues that we are dealing with, for instance, as illustrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. These, while our field is not necessarily, we don't necessarily bring an expertise in health or ecology and so on, or environmental issues, that doesn't mean that those issues aren't part of our existence and part of our classrooms and the communities in which we work and the ways in which we exist in relation. And so I guess when we, when we reflect on the ways in which we were originally trained as language teachers. To what extent did that experience, that education, that professional learning encompass these discussions? Often when we've talked about what is TESOL, not when we've talked about, but when engaged in TESOL programs, especially a long time ago, like 20 years ago, back when we were learning to teach, it was very much focused on skills-based approaches, pragmatic approaches to language teaching. But we would like to talk about a way in which we can expand to seeing these other aspects of our practice as relevant to the language classroom.
In that regards, can I ask one question?
Yes.
Because that's one of the things many, at least some critical scholars in applied linguistics has issues with. I mean, my question is, where does this process or process ontologies or new materialism in applied linguistics has relationship with critical applied linguistics? Is it one of the major concerns that from words of mouth from the critical scholars are it's the post-humanism decenters human practices, and we need to focus on our human practices. And how would you conceptualize or understand these tensions between those who has been established as a critical applied linguist, and then this is the very new lens that may not be fully understood?
I would try to. It is a very, very good question, actually. Very, very important question also. I'll try to answer it, and then Sasi can jump in at any time. I think, first of all, it is not, I think when we propose this, it's not about either or. It's really to expand our thinking and to look at areas that we have neglected before. Because when we think about language, we cannot have, our practice is always in so many ways being shaped by a way of understanding what it is. So the ontology and epistemology is always connected. So you can never separate them, right? The way we look at language in the past is monolingualism. Well, it's not really in the past, but this has been a dominant belief, and that is language is autonomous, and it can stand alone, it can be isolated, right? So this is the ontology, and the ontology will affect the way we know about it, and then the way we know about it will also affect how we use it, we practice it as well. Even though a lot of times in the community, all these practices are different, but they're not being theorized. They're not being accepted as scientific, right? So even though our students are using multilingual practices on their own, but they're seen as defective. And so what we're saying is, first of all, the ontology and epistemology, they're all connected. And we need to, as teachers, we need to recognize where do we stand, and what are some of the biases or our neglect or our ignorance have been preventing us from seeing a broader picture or bigger picture. And so I think translanguaging offers an opening here, because translanguaging talks about transsystemic way of meaning making. And the system, transsystemic meaning making, that means it is beyond languages. And when it is beyond languages, we begin to think about multimodality. We begin to think about our bodily emotions. We begin to think about the material that we have, the technology that we use, because they all affect the way we learn. But then the space, but they're not just add-on factors, because with the human and the non-human, we interact. Okay, I'm not going to disclose too much here, but recently we helped our friend to tidy up the kitchen countertop. And once the kitchen countertop has been tidied up and clear, we find that we like to gather around that countertop. We begin to like have our drinks over and talk and relate to each other. So, and this is one very simple example how space and material affect the way we interact and the extent that we can interact also. It becomes a space where we can stay on rather than just take things and then leave. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but these are the things that we have neglected because when we look at language, we just look at language as if it's isolated from other resources, mobility, objects, and the kind of affordances that are being created because when we bring all these elements together, then we are doing a disservice to ourselves and our students because we don't know that there are opportunities, so many opportunities that we didn't recognize or we haven't been utilizing them to a full extent to help them to know, to be, and to think.
And I think what Sunny is referring to here is these divisions between the material and the non-material world. And to think about what are the networks of meaning making or assemblages of meaning making in any one interaction or relational moment where there's affective resonance of understanding and communication. And so I can think of a couple concrete examples to illustrate further what Sunny is saying that are specific to language. So one, in working with youth from refugee backgrounds in a local secondary school as part of a broader project that I'm involved in looking at language and literacy practices of children and youth who have been displaced and have experienced forced migration. I was working with one particular student who, while he was trying to complete a graphic organizer to describe urban and rural communities in his class, which is a very common kind of comparison language activity, compare an urban space, compare a rural space. The student was not just using his pencil and the paper and his own thinking. He had his iPhone beside him, and on his iPhone, he was using speech-to-text translation software. So it was creating an audio, and also he was able to type in words in his own language and in English, and to hear the language. He was using an iPad to look up pictures of an urban community to give him a prompt to self-scaffold and use a strategy for looking at and describing an urban community. So there was the visual mode. He was also using a picture dictionary that his friend brought over to him. That was a text-based picture dictionary. And so when you look at this assemblage of meaning making that he had constructed, you could very much see the distributed cognition. So it was not just what he was thinking in his own mind, it was also what he was getting from the technology resources, from the multimodal resources, from the peer resources, the print-based resources. And so we can see this moment as a network of meaning that was distributed across all of these linguistic and non-linguistic forms. They were all coming together in an assemblage of meaning making. And another example, which Sunny and I have written about, comes from a colleague of ours, Loretta Robinson, who is a Naskapi Cree educator. And she was teaching us about how children in her Indigenous community make meaning of the word caribou. And when elders teach the word caribou to children in the community, it's not just about the pronunciation of the word. It's not just about how it may be used syntactically or the vocabulary, the lexical items associated with the word caribou. It's also about what the caribou means in terms of the place, the land, and what the animal means to the community, and how the community relates to the animal and non-human life. Mm-hmm. So that is part of the meaning making around that word. And we are very grateful for Loretta for teaching us about that, because I think it also shows us how our theories of language teaching have rendered these ways of making meaning invisible. Where do we talk about that in our principles of language teaching and learning? It's been absent. And so we want to open to these expanded repertoires of practice and expanded assemblages of meaning making, and to make these things visible. It's not that they haven't been there. They've always been there. It's just these ways of thinking help us to see them. And I think we have a lot to learn in Canada, in particular from Indigenous communities that are engaged in Indigenous language revitalization, who make this a part of the way in which they teach. There is a relational element. There is a place-based element. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that the new materialities perspectives and these post-humanist perspectives, they come from one particular lens and mode of scholarship, but and they're different from Indigenous worldviews and knowledges, but they might be talking about some similar things, mm-hmm. helping us to see things that we didn't see before in our theories. We may have known them.
Okay, I'd like to jump in with a question. Now that you mentioned new materiality, post-humanism, so we have scholars like our colleagues, Diane Deschonnet, and Kelly Tuhi. They are pioneers in bringing the post-humanist new materiality perspectives into our field. So my question is, what is the new angle, insights that you bring to the table? This is one question, hold that in mind. And the second question is, now you also shift to translanguaging and the Indigenous peoples' language revitalization efforts. Now we see that there's some debate among Indigenous communities, scholars saying that translanguaging might not help us in keeping our boundary intact, because our younger generations are already speaking too much English, and we need to protect our Indigenous language. We have to protect the boundary. So there has been some debate about how translanguaging can mitigate against the Indigenous communities' efforts. Now you have two strands of ideas on the table. They might interact, they might not. One is the new materiality post-humanism that I mentioned, Diane, Kelly, and Penny Cook, okay? And a strand that you bring to the table is translanguaging. And then you mentioned, now you use the post-humanist, the new materiality, to use the Indigenous example to say how important it is to consider distributed cognition, post-humanist, new materiality. Yes, okay. But then you also mentioned translanguaging, which is somehow we have some debate about how translanguaging can mitigate against the Indigenous communities' efforts. So two questions for you. One is, what's new that you bring to the table, apart from Penny Cook, Kelly Tuhi, Dion Deschonnet's work? We don't want people just to jump onto the bandwagon, right? So I'm very, very serious about this. You have to bring to the table some new insights, okay? Otherwise, it's just consuming other people's theory. And then the translanguaging, the debate, especially the Indigenous communities, people's concerns, you also need to address. So two questions for you.
Maybe I'll try. This is very difficult questions that you posed. We have to acknowledge that this is our emergent thinking. We just finished a co-edited book volume on plurilingual pedagogy. And as the field is moving forward, and as we are reading a bit more, we both, I think Saskia and I, we both see what we haven't seen before as we were doing the edited book volume. And so we would like to articulate what we have been learning and what we have been seeing in the field. And I think we have been drawing on a lot from Darjeeling, Tui, and Pennycook, in the sense that because they really bring in that post-humanist, human decentering perspective, raising that awareness that there are so many other aspects that we haven't looked at, even when we were doing our like theorizing plurilingual pedagogy. And then again, I'm not saying that those are not good anymore. Again, this is never an either or. It's really moving forward. What are some of the things that we should be also looking at? And I think they have allowed us to see that there is an opportunity here right now, as the field is moving towards a more trans approach, beginning to look at how resources and semiotics are linked together and how we should look at it from a more holistic perspective. And I forgot to mention, because Vangi, you mentioned, okay, what is the criticality here? How is it different from critical applied linguistics? I think that in critical applied linguistics, when it was first being theorized by people like Pennycook, the focus is really on broader social, colonial oppression, gender, race, sexuality. But how do these social categories also interact with space and nature, the natural materialities, right? Those are not being considered. And so in his article and also his book on post-human applied linguistics, critical applied linguistics, he did bring in those aspects. And I think what we are trying to do here is try to look at then what are the implications in the field of TESOL, and how do we then still engage students in critical inquiry, not just intellectually, but also bodily, emotionally. And that's why in relation. So we're trying to propose something that is bringing translanguaging, TESOL, and post-humanism and social materialism together.
You're ambitious, but this is good.
Yes.
I mean, it's high time someone did that, but it's not as easy as we thought, right? But someone needs to do it.
Right. And to answer your question, how does it reconcile with like indigenous efforts to revitalize their languages? At least for me, I don't see translanguaging as one monolithic concept or entity. I think it allows us a way to see, like the ontoepistemology, it allows us to see beyond boundaries. And it's not one size fits all.
But when people want to set up boundaries for good reasons.
Yes.
When indigenous communities want to set up boundaries for good reasons, to protect their boundaries.
Right.
This is precisely what Rio Kakubota was arguing about. When people want to, when subordinated groups, their boundaries haven't been protected, and they want to protect their boundaries for good reasons, right? And then you come in with post-humanism, new materiality. That's why they feel a little bit unease. I'm understating it. They feel a lot of unease. And yeah, I know. Hold it. I know you have lots of things to say. Let me ask this question. It's important to address the real concerns of people. I mean, I am a scholar who have a lot of invested a lot of work in translanguaging, but I need to be critical of translanguaging, okay? Yes. And we have a question from Daniel. Hi, Daniel Chan. Recently, in my recent classroom practice, students resist the notion of translanguaging. They think they've come to learn English. And also when Daniel used their Punjabi community language to try to teach them English for academic purposes. They resist, they feel belittled, they feel being singled out. Now, I know you would say, this is pedagogy, you can change your pedagogy, right? But I think translanguaging scholars need to take seriously the motivational aspects and the policy aspects. Here, this is where the critical scholars, their work is still so relevant, because all these structures, policy structures, okay, the IELTS, the TOEFL, the admission policies of the university, all these policy structures, if we haven't changed those policy structures, right, then translanguaging is just a scaffolding tool for them to reach the dominant resources to survive the dominant structure. Then we are still not overcoming the hierarchy like Jürgen Jasper's critique of translanguaging. Okay, sorry for being a little bit, but I need to force myself, I mean, I have done a lot of research, and our colleagues in translanguaging to take seriously the concerns of the frontline teachers, practitioners, that they do have real concerns. Okay, so over to you again. Sorry for.
Can I just add a point, then I'll ask Saskia to continue, okay? I think we never looked at translanguaging as if it is a one-size-fits-all practice. And the reason why we want to focus on the teachers engaging in critical inquiry with students is exactly the reason why, the reason that you raised. Because we cannot just look at the theory and then apply it blindly onto our classrooms. And the most important thing is, this is a different way of looking at language. Language is not just teaching, it's about working it with the students through engaging them in something real and matters to them. And so, and that is why it's not about applying the theory onto the classroom. It's about working with the students, going on this journey, discovering it together, while paying attention to how we embrace all these multilingual, multisensory, multimodal opportunities that they can create knowledge and become an agentive, agents in participating in change with the students and with the teachers. And so then in the case of a context when students, for whatever reasons, they will need that language of dominance, then we can still do it. It's not either or. It's really about engaging them in understanding why they're doing it, for what purpose, and to what extent they can, and what are the give and take. I will let Saskia, sorry, jump in.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting discussion, and I think, Angel, you really raise a good point, that the theory of language in and of itself does not make something critical. It doesn't make an approach critical, a particular theory that we might adopt. And so in terms of when we are working with students in different classrooms, when we're working with teachers, it's very important that we have a theory of language that we are that we are grounded in, but that can't overstep what the needs of a particular community are. It can't overstep what the needs of children, youth, their parents, their communities say is important to them. And so when we talk about engaging in TESOL as embodied practice, what we're speaking of is having a relational experience with our students, with our classrooms, with their families, so that we can develop an understanding of how to teach after that. And I think why we're interested in having this conversation in TESOL, very much informed by the work of scholars like yourself. Also, you mentioned Diane Dagenet and Colleen Toohey and Alistair Pennycook. Their writing, all of this writing around post-humanism and new materialities has been incredibly thought-provoking for us to say, what do we do with this in TESOL? What do we do with this when we are talking to practicum students? How do we bring this into a place of central importance in our classrooms? And we do that, I'll say how I do that is by talking about this embodied practice, talking about creating affective connection with students so that there is this opportunity to engage that is not just text-based, that is not just about teaching language as print-based, but that is about having an understanding of our relationality with one another, with our broader communities, and with the broader eco-social concerns in our lives, because that is what we use language for. Language, the world through, it is a mode of meaning making. It's part of that, again, I'll use that word assemblage, that is transsystemic. And so if we begin with that understanding, it invites an opportunity for that co-construction of knowledge that is not just limited to the humans that are in the room, that is not just limited to the print-based text or the digital technologies that are around us, but that invites all the interactants into that assemblage of meaning making. Because I think when we don't see those, when we have a theory of language that doesn't make space for these other interactants, we start to universalize. And we get away from the particular, and we get away from the political and the eco-social political. And that then does a disservice to the advocacy work that we wish to be engaged in.
Yes, thanks for very good. Yeah. Let me try to structure the discussion this way. Otherwise, you're offering two levels. Muklis, sorry. Okay. You're offering two. Okay, Muklis.
Carry on.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry. I'm exercising the chair's privilege. There are two levels of advancing your project. One is advancing the theory, and one is advancing the practice pedagogy. And we need to differentiate the two, because theory, as you said, doesn't translate into practice. But right now we have some confusion among teachers. They think, oh, translanguaging, I go into my classroom and I do translanguaging. That's confusing theory with practice, because practice would always have the context. You cannot just say, oh, I'll do translanguage. I'll force you to translanguage. Muklis translanguage, Xinhua translanguage, right? Right now, the confusion is people jumping onto the bandwagon. Oh, let's translanguage, whatever the context. If the context is indigenous communities, if the context is the policy context, that students are so much attached to the dominant resources. So there are two levels of advancing your project. One is advancing the theory. One is advancing the pedagogy, which has to take into account the context. But we always see people mix up the two kinds of discussion. They use examples from the contextual practice level to counter the theory. And then people just come back with more theory and not looking at the context as we are talking like this, right? So I'm trying to structure the discussion. Otherwise, we're just going in circles and circles to talk about theory. They talk about contextual practice, and we never will meet up, right? Now, in terms of practice, I think Yasonet, Dirk Gotter, they talk about context. Context is so important. The theory is you understand that even if you think it's a theory that has a lot of warrants, and that if people in the context don't believe in it, then it doesn't work for them. okay? Because of self-fulfilling prophecy. So in terms of advancing your project, two kinds of considerations. Now, theory, you have to advance critical post-humanism. Right now, I don't see anyone engaged, including Pinnacle, including my dear colleagues, Diane or Kelly. They talk about new materiality, they talk about post-humanism. They haven't engaged in how to integrate critical theory with new materiality post-humanism. This is the cutting edge point. I can almost imagine you writing a book on critical post-humanism in TESOL, right? Now you need to attack the soft points right on spot. Otherwise, we go circle and circle. Theoretical advancement cannot be achieved if you don't address how you can integrate critical theory with post-humanist theory or reconcile their ontological and epistemological differences. In terms of practice and pedagogy, context-wise, we have Spivak, Gayatri Spivak, talking about strategic essentialism. So we could, I mean, in terms of theory, we believe in no boundaries. But in terms of practice, with the context requires that we can have temporarily strategic essentialism, setting up boundaries, right? So we attack these two levels right on spot, and instead of going in circle and circle, right? Sorry for my taking the chair's privilege, but I need to set out the agenda for research. Otherwise, we go in circles and circles. You talk about theory, they talk about practice, and we never really address the real theoretical issues and the real pedagogical issues. Sorry, Marcus, over to you.
Right, yeah. My question is a practical question, actually. I was just reminded of what Saskia was mentioning earlier on the approach that we have been trying to formulate is to address issues of inequity, and translanguaging in a way, helps to address that. But hand in hand in translanguaging is also the issue of critical reading text critically or critical literacy. And in practice, because the previously dominant approach in teaching is that there is only one particular view of language. There's only that, that is a top-down approach of teaching, where both teachers and students are more familiar, comfortable in practicing, pedagogy on the part of the teachers, and also in terms of learning on the part of students that are passive in nature, as far as the students are concerned, that they receive knowledge as how the teachers bring to them, rather than they being critical of what is being given to them. So I suppose your approach is trying to address the cultural differences, linguistic differences, and to add value to their cultural experience. But at the same time, they are much more entrenched in the other way of learning and teaching. So my question is actually, how do you address a way of teaching and learning that has been entrenched in many ways, to convert it into something which is more amenable to the kind of approaches that you are trying to promote? In the sense, students would no longer be controlled into using only that language in the classroom, but also there are other linguistic and also semiotic resources that they can use in the classroom. And at the same time, enabling them to be more critical of what they read, of what they do, so that, in Paulo Freire's literacy to off the clutches of the system, and to enable them to look at issues in a more responsible way, that they have a sense of agency in learning and acquiring the knowledge that they gain from the text. That is my one question. The other question is also practical concern is in situations where the dominant language is really dominant, that the target language has very little space in the community. Now, translanguaging would take some space away from that language, because then you won't be using just that target language, but also the dominant language. So how do you address such concerns? By using translanguaging, you are limiting further the space for that target language.
Shall I go ahead and I'll try to answer the first question first. Maybe I'll show an example, a research study that I did with a group of immigrant students, and they're new arrival. So they just came in August, in summer, and then they start their education in English. That was when I was in Toronto, so when I haven't moved to Quebec yet. And I was working with this ESL teacher and like explained to her, and I've been working with her for a year already by then. We talked about critical literacy, and she really liked the idea of engaging students to read and question. But then the query that she always has, the wondering that she always has is, how can I do that with beginning English language learners? And in the process, they were working together. And one thing that is very, very important that I, as a new researcher at the time, I also realized that it is always a process. If we look at language as socialization, how you're being socialized into reading a certain way and writing a certain way, right? We learn that practice. And the same, if we want to promote critical literacy, it's not about looking at the student and say, okay, now he is not capable. But rather the question we have to ask us is, how can I support his engagement in critical learning? Not as a rhetorical question, but as a real question, asking yourself, what could be some of the steps that you can help him to socialize him into that practice? Having said that, it doesn't mean that they're not critical, because outside school, they have been exercising on the playground. They have been exercising that critical, questioning. They'll be challenging their parents, raising a lot of, arguments. But those are not being recognized. Those are being suppressed, right? We can't say no. Or the way we teach, we are socializing them into docile bodies, right? They listen to you. This is the only way to do it, because we never encourage that behavior. And so what did I do in that project? So we started with the first month, we call it the bridging program. Because they have no functional English at the time, because many of them never had English education before. And so we introduced some basic vocabulary, functional English, so that they can survive in an English environment. But at the same time, we started a blog where they have to share their work with other students. Now, the sharing itself at the beginning is like you have to upload your work, and then you have to read each other's work and give comments. And the comments at the beginning were very, very formulaic, because we need to teach them those phrases to comment. But again, this is to gradually socialize them into seeing that learning is not about individual. It's about learning together. It's about being able to see what people say and learn from them, and then learn from their comments towards your work. So gradually, the comments become more individual. So they go beyond the formulaic expressions and also becoming more genuine. So for example, they will comment on each other's use of adjectives, that the adjective may carry negative connotation. So they're already exercising that kind of criticality. So what I want to say is, how do we create that environment and the classroom practice that encourage that kind of collaborative inquiry. Because it is really a process that we go through together. It's not about just the ability, right? But it is the process we experience, because the more we experience, the more we are more in tune to that kind of questioning. We embody that practice, and that is also one of the keywords in our heading, the title.
If I would be allowed to summarize what you said, is the problem with a lot of frontline or a lot of us in this translanguaging debate is translanguaging is taken as another set of procedures, but not as what you say. What you and Saskia say is as collaborative critical inquiry together.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no like ready-made lunch, ready-made Monday morning teaching kit, but translanguaging got reduced to a quick fix. Okay, if I do this, everything will be okay. But no, what you are saying is it's not a toolkit. I mean, it's not like a quick fix kit. Translanguaging theory, from what you're saying, I hear you, is that it means teacher students engage in collaborative, equitable inquiry. Not, no, I'm a teacher, now I have translanguaging pedagogy, now I'm going to try out in my classroom. Oh, you don't like it? Oh, translanguaging pedagogy is bad. It's not applicable in my classroom. So then we forget about it, right? But what you're saying is we have to revisit translanguaging and post-humanism.
Yes.
As critical sociolinguistic inquiry. Okay, so that's good.
Yeah, and I think you raised a really good point. We are absolutely not talking about a kind of curriculum that we tell teachers what to do and they implement. That is the opposite of what we're saying. We're talking about teachers generating curriculum and generating this curriculum with their students, co-articulating curriculum with their students after bringing a critical sociolinguistic inquiry into their classroom, when engaging in embodied practice that produces these affective intensities in the classroom between teachers and students, between classrooms and communities, between humans and non-humans. So I think there's a few things that we need to clarify here, that we can't really say what translanguaging pedagogy is in that sense, because it is a theory that we presently see as one that makes space for this kind of practice. Because, for example, for myself, this was the way that I did pedagogy in my classrooms, but I couldn't find in any textbook about TESOL a definition of what I was doing. And so what we're attempting to do is to write this so that teachers who do this already in their practice, and we don't want to say that teachers aren't already doing this. There's many teachers out there that do this kind of work in their practice with students. But we wanted to write something that so teachers could see themselves and their practice as legitimate in this way. And presently we see translanguaging theories and translanguaging pedagogies as making space for this kind of practice. Now, with that said, there are a couple cautions. One, I'd like to draw on Ophelia Garcia and colleagues, their recent publication on challenging the abyssal line in TESOL that was published in Critical Inquiry of and Language Studies, CILS, where they talked about translanguaging theory as helping us to challenge the line itself. Like, rather than helping students to meet a particular English standard, and rather than talking about pedagogies and translanguaging pedagogies that still might help students reach that standard, and I think this is what you were talking about, Nicholas, let's get rid of that line altogether. Let's get rid of that standard altogether, and then find a different way of teaching language then, when that line is gone. But I also want to be really mindful that I speak about this as a white scholar, a cisgender female scholar located in the global north, let's be very realistic that these ways of thinking usually only work for those who have benefited from the status quo. So we have to be really careful when we're thinking about translanguaging. We don't want it to just benefit those who are already benefiting from the status quo, because, and Sunny and I write about this, is that this benefits then those who are already accustomed to the idea that change is possible. Because for many communities, and even for our whole eco-social system, and thinking about climate change, and again, thinking about how the global pandemic has affected communities differently. What difference does translanguaging make to challenge the inequities associated with safe healthcare practices, or community safety vis-a-vis exposure to the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic? It doesn't, like, what difference does that make? There is little difference. So let's not kid ourselves that we are doing something that is transformative here. Those are the real social and ecological crises of our times that we need to be concerned about. So when we talk about engaging in translanguaging pedagogies or using a translanguaging lens or theory, you know, for who does that still benefit? And there are these deep-seated structural inequalities that we need to acknowledge, and that's where I think this post-humanism and new materialities can make space for that. And let's be really mindful of the fact that otherwise we're just selling everyone a version of cruel optimism. Lauren Berlant talks about this cruel optimism in education, that our proposition could result in transformation on any grand scale. I would greatly hesitate to make such claims. Of course, we have to retain hope that this kind of change is possible, but you know, let's not drink the Kool-Aid about transformative potential all the time, because if we're not doing the critical work already, if we're not doing the advocacy, if we're not addressing structural inequities of climate change, of crises that are manifest in the lives of human and non-human life, then what difference does that make? And so I go back to that abyssal line that Garcia and colleagues talked about. What if we get rid of that line altogether? And then what if we collaboratively work towards addressing these broader social inequities? Because isn't that what language is also good for?
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a question from Phoebe from Hong Kong, now that you mentioned scholars outside of North America. So I just read her question to you. What do you see as intercultural and intracultural differences when addressing your proposed frameworks to teachers in the US and Canada and in China or Hong Kong or Asia? So it really tacks onto what you're mentioning, because you are positioned in North America, right, just now. Whereas in a lot of Asian colleagues, they think it's not possible to change. And they also, even about this critical agenda, they think we need to feed our people first before we talk about the climate change. You can say, okay, you cannot feed your people if we all die because of climate change. But then say, we all die now if we don't feed our people first. And we all die in 100 years, but we all die now in 5 years. So even what you take for granted as critical agenda can be up for grabs. The people can, this is my critical agenda, this is your critical agenda. Now you are advancing your critical agenda above my critical agenda. Okay. Okay. I'm just being the devil's advocate, because as someone who is really intercultural, I've heard these arguments in social media, in education conferences all the time that you guys from North America, from Canada, you bring all these theories. But now our critical agenda is A, B, C, D, E, which are so different from yours.
To that, I just want to say yes, you're absolutely right. And this also points to the ethical responsibility in our field, and that when we're talking about translanguaging pedagogy, we can't understand it outside of an ethic of humanity, but also not just humanity, but the non-human life as well. What are our ethical responsibilities? And again, even though this may not be the focus of our field necessarily, it is something that when we are talking to teachers about a practice or a methodology in TESOL, this is part of this has to be part of the conversation. And so what methodological approaches make space for this in the conversation? And I think this is where inquiry is really important. And so rather than necessarily teaching teachers about methods or strategies or providing resources, these off-the-shelf solutions, instead, let's engage in teaching teachers about inquiry and embodied practice and ethical practice that they can build the strategies, resources, and materials from. And we have to be careful. And I think we've seen during the shift to remote and hybrid and online teaching contexts where, in the past, we might have thought, oh, technology is this big liberator. It's going to create all kinds of room for democratizing participation in the public sphere and so on. But when we talk about education, if we don't make space for teachers to engage in inquiry, if we don't prioritize inquiry, then even the use of technology can be nothing more than a digital worksheet. And there's a labor aspect to all of this as well, because it's a lot easier to buy, a lesson plan online, or to buy some computer software or cloud-based software that allows us to create these digital worksheets that require no thinking, versus to, pay teachers time to engage in inquiry-based practice with their colleagues, with their students. And so when we turn TESOL and teaching into a technical, instrumental, transactional activity, and we remove these opportunities for inquiry and embodied practice with peers, with colleagues in specific places, that's where we can come up with situated, contextualized approaches that might work for our context. But often there are no resources to pay teachers to do that. And there's no time for a busy teacher to engage with their colleagues in asking questions and engaging in that kind of peer review that you do with your colleagues, and developing your professional judgments through dialogue, through collaboration. And so,
and we see
that's why inquiry is central to our
we see neoliberalism working against all of that.
Yeah.
I see, if you look at the history of TESOL development, whether theory or pedagogy, is wave upon wave of neo-technical methods like communicative approach or task-based approach, and then they might also turn, they're very powerful in co-opting new approaches, like they turn clear approaches, content-based approaches, and now the latest, maybe they want to co-opt translanguaging approaches. They just turn it into an instrument, a ready-made package. But it's not what I find so refreshing from you, coming from you, Sunny and Saskia, is you say as critical sociolinguistic inquiry and embodied practice. So there's no way you can pre-package this into task-based approach, communicative approach, or even clear or content-based approaches.
Sorry, I just want to add that's why we place inquiry in the center, and the need for teachers to reposition and to re-see themselves as researchers rather than technicians to carry out other people's theory, because they are way capable, because they are doing it every day in the
They're very capable, but they don't have the time, they don't have the energy because of neoliberalist work conditions. Back to your post-humanist, the material conditions is the squeezing teachers, squeezing them. They don't have enough time to sleep, to take care of their well-being, right? Now you're asking me to do inquiry. Where got my time to do the inquiry, right? Oh, no, I cannot do it. I will buy a worksheet from online, this my worksheet. So back to the critical theory. You cannot just talk about critical sociolinguistic embodied inquiry without looking at all these constraining structures. So I see one way out is these critical theory, looking at the socio-political, economic policy structures. They are part of the post-humanism, because post-humanism looking at all the eco-material environment constraining us. So that's one way that we can converge. I mean, overlap at least the critical theorists' concerns. They always look at the overpowering structures, right? The critical theorists. And they have been critiqued of talking about the powerful structures too much, not too much about agency, right? So yeah, okay. Back to Bungie.
And what you say, Angel, it really, what you say just really brings out the overlap among all of these pieces. You cannot do one without the other.
This macro, this micro, and this psychic. I always have these three levels are just researchers' analytical lenses, but at the same time, they always happen at the same time. At the psychic level, like Daniel's students, psychologists, they have this post-colonial desire for colonial English. At the psychic level, my students back in Hong Kong say, Angel, don't speak Cantonese, speak English only. I only need you to speak English to me. We have this post-colonial desire for English at the psychic level. But this psychic level is aftermath, is co-evolving with the legacy of colonial systems, political structures. And the micro level of microaggression every day. If you are seen to speak Punjabi or Cantonese in the classroom, you are singled out as, oh, you're an international student, your English has a deficit. At micro level, if we repeatedly are subjected to microaggressions, then when you come to me, talk about translanguaging pedagogy, I say, no way, I can't do it. I have to stick to English in order to lift myself out of that pigeonhole, that you cannot label me as an international student who has a deficit in English. So you have to speak Punjabi, you have to speak Cantonese, right? So it's very contextual. But everything, the macro, the micro, the macro is all the colonial, secular colonialism, empire colonialism, all the military, all the visible, invisible cultural structures, they're happening at the same time. Macro, microaggressions, and psychic desire. That's why I resist you. You teacher, how dare you speak Punjabi to me? I come here to learn English. I have the strong desire to learn English, to lift myself out of this stigma. And now you are pigeonholing me into the stigma again. I hate you, right? I can almost feel the desire and the resistance of the students. So psychic level, microaggression level, and the macro level of all these critical, powerful structures, but we ought to address all at the same time. Sorry for being emotional, because I myself have been subjected to repeatedly to macro, micro, and psychic level of aggressions. That's why it brings up my emotion and body practice. Back to you guys.
And I love that you bring the emotion there. The emotion, the affect, that resonance, that is present in this entanglement. We're all entangled.
Students' emotions need to be taken seriously. Their psychic level of desire to belong, not to be stigmatized, not to be pigeonholed, needs to be.
And I'm not sure that the translanguaging theory in and of itself makes space for emotion. in that way. Like, it's not necessarily part of the way the theory has been evolving so far, but and that's why when Sunny and I have been writing about this recently, we're like, this is the theory that's working for us right now.
But you
can't put everything on one theory. No, you can't put everything on one theory, and that's why there's also these other aspects that we want to open.
We will need to address emotions. I don't agree you can't put everything on a theory. A good theory needs to address both cognition and emotion and embodied.
Yes,
I think latest articulations of translanguaging, for example, Thibault and his colleagues, they've been talking about how the emotional aspects is also the way we construct knowledge, right? The way we learn, we get to know something, and that's why that also linked with, for example, Hilary Jang, who talked about the critical literacy should not be staying on the intellectual level, because how we believe in something, why we hold something so strongly or feel something so strongly, it reflects our inner beliefs, and sometimes we don't even know rationally. And
it's not just cognitive beliefs, it's carved out into our body.
Right.
The amygdala, okay? That is, whenever we have been subjected to microaggressions so many times as linguistic minorities, it's
and so
almost automatic bodily response, the emotional response. I feel belittled when you speak to me in that way.
Right. Yeah, and so tapping into those, or allowing students to engage in an inquiry through different avenues, allow them to see things that are not visible in one avenue, because you allow them to see and feel different things, right? Looking at a picture or movie, listening to a piece of music can conjure up memories and feelings towards certain things, and allow you to reflect on certain things that you're not able to do just by reading or deconstructing a text.
A lot of the time the beliefs are not beliefs, they are emotions carved into our bodies. So we still use the language of cognitivism. We talk about teacher beliefs, teacher cognition, which is part of it. I do believe in that. A lot of the time, the invisible so-called beliefs are emotions carved into our body, carved out into our body by past experiences.
Yeah.
And Angel, where you write about the process ontology and these understandings of knowledge as emergent connected flows, right? Distributed across all of these assemblages of meaning making and linguistic and non-linguistic forms, that makes space for this kind of becoming along the way, instead of a final product. And I think that also aligns with that going against this abyssal thinking, where we're going towards a process of becoming rather than trying to help students meet a standard. Instead, let's dismantle the standard.
We can do that.
Altogether.
It's not either or, right? We can do help them to meet a standard. We can also co-evolve, co-become with them together.
Yes, I like that co-evolve.
I do need to help my students to survive in the system, to meet the standard. Okay, but it's not either or, like what you said.
Yeah.
Bongi, you have any? Sorry, Bongi, you have?
No, go ahead.
Yes, I do have one question. Actually, when Angel in the earlier on asked Sunny and Saskia about the contribution of the study, this piece, I actually, from a reader's perspective, one thing that I really love about this article is that it really visualizes how does process epi-ontologies or new materialism can be applied to the curriculum development. And it helps teachers to imagine, in my setting, I can design this curriculum this way. And so it was so eye-opening for me. But at the same time, I was thinking about, okay, if this is a homeroom teacher who has a lot of control in designing her own materials and her own curriculum throughout the term, I think it's possible. Like, some of the examples are very much applicable especially in Canadian context. But as I'm also working with some of the pre-service teachers, there is an ELL specialist who are located in a somewhat different position from the homeroom teachers in school settings, where they are pulling a couple of ELL students for additional language support, and with very few contact hours. And I'm just not sure how these ELL teachers in the school system, in K-12 in particular, can design a curriculum inspired by these new material perspectives. And then another line of question that I have is that a lot of the institutions are being dominated by standardization, such as TOEFL. Like for international students to come to university, they have to submit IELTS or TOEFL scores that are standardized. And then when the students are exiting from their programs, the university have an accreditation body that they are subject to this larger worldwide standardization. And we are constantly the whole educational system becomes more of a standardized, like in the US, the Common Core in every state, they have sets of standardized curriculum and assessment criteria. And then these are different kinds of systems that isn't one's fault, or one person can move away from this loops of different systems. So in having that situation, having that in context, where a lot of the ELL teachers are relatively have a powerless position, where they are being seen as, well, you just teach language here. We'll be dealing with academic content and just teach them the grammar. And so they're always often positioned as a supplement for students to be mainstreamed, or supplement for them to be accepted into the university admission, or certain kinds of language requirement. How can we, do you see teacher educators to design a curriculum that is manageable for them in given this environment?
That's a really good question, Ponki. And we do see, for example, in the Ontario context where I work, we do see ESL teachers working in a wide variety of situations. Like you mentioned, they could have sheltered pull-out instruction where they have students with them for, just 40 minutes in a day, for example. And I guess this is where I would suggest that, again, there's no set prescriptive methods or techniques that one can apply here. Instead, it goes back to thinking about what is the theory of language, what is the theory of practice that is underpinning one's work. And so again, when we think about TESOL, we often haven't necessarily started TESOL programs, especially undergraduate TESOL programs or certificate programs. It's different for graduate work. Graduate work absolutely begins with theories of language, but short TESOL programs usually don't begin with this discussion of what is the theory of language that is underpinning one's instructional practice. And so once I think teachers reflect on and develop and have the space to explore the theories of language that they have, that shapes their practice. And that theory of language doesn't have to come from scholarly texts. It can be a theory of language that comes from their own grounded and situated practice in their own classroom. They can develop that grounded theory based on observation of their students. And so again, when we're talking about TESOL work and teacher professional learning, and teacher education, that means making sure that in our TESOL programs, we give attention and space to supporting teachers to become inquirers of their own classrooms, inquirers of their students, and with their students, importantly, with their families, with their school communities, embedded in their particular material, spatial contexts on particular lands. What does it mean to be a teacher in that space? And beginning from there, I think it will change. It like that butterfly effect. It has a ripple effect in the classroom. So even if you do only have your students for 40 minutes every other day, if you begin from that place, you will teach differently. And so that's why I think that TESL has to make space for that critical sociolinguistic inquiry. Are we doing that? And one of my colleagues, Dr. Mario Lopez Gopar, who's also a colleague of Sunny, who teaches in Oaxaca, Mexico, in their TESL program, inquiry is part of teacher education from day one.
They have to do an action research.
Yeah, they do. And I don't think we do that as much here in the Canadian context.
In my situation, because it's in Quebec and ESL is a subject, so it is more like Hong Kong or Southeast Asian countries, because you are not using English to learn other subjects. English
in Hong
is
Kong, we have EMI schools. We do use, but it's not like in Taiwan or in South Korea. Yeah.
Right, in most public schools, right. And so we have the teacher education program, and I introduced, when I got my job, I introduced this course called Critical Pedagogical Orientation to Second Language. And to this day, I'm still so proud of myself and proud that the School of Education allowed me to create this course, to engage with student teachers, all these socio-political, ideological, and eco-social issues, and to inquire, look back into language and their own language practice. And from day one, I've been emphasizing on them being a researcher. And this also, over the years, I also learned to change the way I teach. Instead of teaching to them, I learned to bring them to the classroom and do inquiry together. Like when we teach elementary school reading, we looked at the theory, we discussed, but then we all go to a classroom and we work, students work in pairs with the children individually, and to notice, do observation, note down all the observations that they have using some theory or concepts that they learned already in class, to allow them to understand, to create a profile for the student. You have to learn a bit better about what the students are capable of, what they're interested in, what we can do to then move them further on. And so, and how we engage them in languages, because a lot of them are Francophone students, so they have other languages in their hand. So we'll come back and discuss and brainstorm for strategies for a next step, and we'll go back and implement and try out some ideas that we come up with, and then we come back and debrief. So the change practice allowed me and also the students to learn together as researchers. So from day one, I've been emphasizing them as a researcher, because that will be the skill that they will need later on when they get into wherever they will be. That is the idea of, I can make agentive choices because I can be resourceful. I can look up, I can try to understand my students and look up resources of what I can make a change despite all the constraints that we have in the context.
You're planting seeds, right? Planting seeds using the metaphor in these pre-surface teachers. And coming from Hong Kong, we have this undercover story. When all the structures don't allow me to do what I believe to be beneficial to my students, that doesn't mean that I don't believe, right? You're planting those seeds into the teachers when they go out to teach, when all the structures work against us, right? I can still be an undercover teacher. Now I want to invite.
Sorry, can I add one point? It's not just planting the seeds, but have them experience it. And again, going back to the whole embodied practice.
Yeah.
Because when they experience it,
the bodily seeds is not the cognitive seeds. It's an emotional seed, bodily seeds. And Mokes and Qinghua will have the last two questions. I'm aware of the time.
I just want to jump in, just to follow up from what Sunny was saying just now. Sometimes the fears of teachers are really real. It's not something that you can just move away from the structures that they are working.
Oh, do we lose?
We lose the Wi-Fi maybe, but Mokes was saying teachers cannot just easily move away from the structures, right? And
no, right. So I think you're right, definitely right, and I, as what Saskia has said, I'm so conscious of the advantageous position I have. But at the same time, I've been teaching myself for many years. And that is why one thing I really want to bring to the table is how we can work with teachers instead of work on them.
That's right.
Because I think it is so important for me, right? I'm from a university and I have to know the context. I always have to get to know them as a person.
So that's why I like your embodied practice. Work with them, not just at the cognitive level, but at the emotional level, at the bodily level, experiential, lived experience level. That's so important.
What change is possible there?
Right, exactly.
From teacher's perspective.
Together pushing boundaries, together, but not you are pushing them, but you are with them, together pushing boundaries, not you are pushing them to push boundaries, right? I'd like to invite
I was just reminded of the work by Louis Moll and his colleagues at the University of Arizona when they wanted to come up with this idea of funds of knowledge, where teachers need to actually go down to the field, to the families, spend time with the families to find out what are the resources that are available to the students. And so there was this collaboration between the teachers who know the families better and the researchers who are able to provide the framework, the conceptual theory of how to go about doing those kind of research. And initially, the teachers were fearful of the kind of commitment that they have to pour in to do this thing. But then with the collaboration, with the advice and support from the researchers, they were moved to do the research. And then at the end of it, they realized that there's a lot to gain from Sunny was saying that they need to be researchers, right? But I think there needs to be some kind of hand-holding before they are more confident of how to go about, practicing the kind of framework that you are proposing. Right. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, also evidence. We need evidence to move the policymakers as well, because so that teachers won't be working in this new framework, but still within the old structures that would constrain in the classroom and outside.
Pushing together.
And if I can pick up on what Muklas is saying there too, that when we are talking about engaging teachers in research, I think it's really important to think about what kind of inquiry. And this is absolutely not the kind of inquiry that is just making our students the object of our analysis. We would have to make it's actually about ourselves too, and or more importantly, about how are all of these aspects of inquiry. It can't just be about how are we transforming our students, or how helping our students. It's how are we helping ourselves to dismantle, in Canada, for instance, the settler colonialism within which we as educators are embedded. Our entire education system is embedded within a terrible legacy of residential schooling, and we are not outside of that conversation. And so when we inquire about the context of our language teaching and learning, how are we understanding ourselves? How are we understanding the ways in which we have been talked through and, implicated in these aspects of settler colonialism, these histories, not just in Canada, but in elsewhere as well, because these are global movements that are very important. And so it's important that when we're looking at these structures of education, we're also turning the lens on ourselves to see how do we fit within this, and how are we problematizing our own practices? What have we rendered invisible? And I like in my TESL classes to engage students in thinking about themselves by doing things, very simple tasks like creating their own language portraits about themselves, writing their own language learning histories or their linguistic autobiographies, interviewing a member of their own family as an informant to help them learn about how their family has been shaped by patterns of settler colonialism and migration in the world. And so when we can, peel back layers of the onion on our own selves, then maybe we can bring that into the classroom. And I think that's part of the ethics that is required for this work. And why the word critical is central to the way in which we understand this.
It's self-reflexivity, particularly reflecting on our complicity with the unequal power relations.
It's very humbling.
Absolutely.
Right? As a teacher educator, is first humbling ourselves. Last but not least, Qinghua, you haven't said much yet.
Yes, thank you. And in order to show myself, I have changed into this mode so that we can see everybody. I really do have a lot of questions, but everyone is so excited, and I also been hearing a lot of interesting comments. So I reserved my question for now. But before I ask my question, I would like to read the question that I see from the chat from Heather Whistler. Because I think the question that she asked really resonate with me. She said, should the teacher see education through a translanguaging lens, but the students, their parents and institution have another lens? Is it incumbent on the teacher to learn to be advocate? So I read this question. I think it resonates with me. And I feel like personally, I really want to be an advocate of translanguaging, and I now have always been trying to do that. I feel like I've learned a lot of interesting things and in this discussion today. And at the same time, I also feel that as a graduate student, I have the privilege to be sitting here and having the chance of listening and engaging in all these discussions. But not everyone have that opportunity as well. And the general opinion in the public regarding the idea about translanguaging is also really important, I believe. Maybe people only have 5 minutes while they were cooking their lunch, and they only have 5 minutes to listen to these ideas. How can we translate these ideas in a way that will unite more people in this translanguaging movement, rather than saying that we know what we're doing and we want to engage teachers, we want to engage policymakers, but I think that's not enough, because policymakers is under influence and maybe is like have tensions with parents and others, right? So what I'm also excited is that I heard yesterday that Sunny, Angel, and Saskia is going to have a sub channel on this YouTube channel to have more work with the teachers. So I think that not everyone speaks our academic language, and not everyone have the time to join an academic session like this that lasts for 90 minutes. So we really have to find ways that we can unite more people. We can have more friends in this movement, I would say. So that's my comments. I want to hear the opinion of your I want to hear your opinions too.
Okay, I'll add my piece and turn it over to Sunny. I think what is inspiring, Qinghua, about what you've said is that it reminds us all about the importance of collaboration. None of this work happens alone. And even in today's conversation, we've referenced the work of many, many other scholars in diverse locations. We've the work of teachers. We've reflected on students that have inspired us. We didn't, just come here today with this kind of idea, but it's built over long-standing, sustainable collaborations. And I want to emphasize that word sustainable because research projects or specific activities, it's easy to do things in a one-off, but that's not what's going to work in long-term change. We need these sustainable collaborations that are mutually beneficial. And I look forward to more of this with this wonderful group of people and to what will come, and this idea of becoming, and also seeing that this isn't static. It's part of this process ontology. It's part of this flow that keeps moving.
Co-becoming, dynamical, and all those feedback loops.
Yeah.
Exact.
And I'll just add my 2 cents here. And I totally agree with what Saskia said. We see this as a process. And when I do research, it's always a process of relating to my teachers. I think that is so important. If we don't have that piece, then you are just imposing a view on them. You have to work with them together and see what the constraints they've been experiencing. So we share our life, we share our knowledge, because we co-create something here. And it is never ending. It's a process. And so Bonji, earlier you mentioned about the ELL specialists working alone. Find resources, right? Find colleagues, find allies, because there are people also out there who is worrying, okay, how can I support these students because I have no experience, right? There are people who are longing for that kind of partnership. And again, get to know your research partners' level of comfort, where they are now, what is their understanding, and work with them, and to find possibilities of change where you can push the envelope, where you will just stay and let be. I think that is so important. And so it's not about changing overnight. It's really about building a relationship together. And that's why the whole idea of interacting with each other in relation.
So I think that's a good note for us to end on. I always say I'm the best, but what's the best about me is not I am the best. It's kind of a paradox. I am the best, but what's the best about me is not I am the best. It's about my collaborators are the best, and I am the best because my collaborators are the best. Okay, so and I'm working on building sustainable collaboration across generations, so the next generation of scholars, across different generations of scholars, and across different disciplines. And we are just too limited by our own disciplines, right? So we cannot afford to be very protective of our own limited visions. So I'm always learning. And today, once again, I want to thank Sunny, Saskia, and also our co-hosts, Moklis, Qinghua, Bongi, and Phoebe in Hong Kong. I think it's just a beginning. Just as 2 years ago, both Dr. Sunny Now and Dr. Saskia Van Wiegen, you gave the inaugural seminar in our TLTS seminar series. So this is after 2 years, we come back to you for more inspirations. And we got so many inspirations the embodied practice, the code, right? And the humbling exercise of co-becoming and looking back at ourselves. So again, thanks so much for our audience who have stayed with us all these 90 minutes. So, Qinghua, would you want to introduce our next seminar, which is in November? And we also happy to have another seminar lined up for us. So, Qinghua can show the poster before you leave. And remember to share our channel, give us a like, okay? If you haven't done so already. It's just to motivate us to do more of these seminars. Yeah. Okay, so the next seminar poster. Yes, we have Dr. James Coherent from York University to talk about critical plurilingualism in an age of Anglophone hegemony. What a good topic, right? We are all talking about English standards, learning English, English only principle, right? English only classrooms, right? So look out for that in North American times, November 19, in Asian Pacific times, November 20. So until then, I want to thank our guests once more. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.